you made reference to the modern left, to some or even many becoming Maoist.
Yes.
And for the listeners, I think I know what you mean, but tell us what you mean by that.
Well, you have a very weird coupling on the technical left. So with Dick Morris and Bill Clinton effectively becoming a second Republican Party, you then had a problem which is, how do I replace organized labor as a voting bloc? And my wife, Pia Milani's great insight here was, she's an economist with the Institute for New Economic Thinking, a Soros-funded institute.
Now we've got the left-wing bona fides again. All right, I'm reoriented.
Her point was that you need something cheaper than labor because labor makes economic demand. So there's always a search for who's willing to accept the least. And the thing that you can actually get voters with for people who are willing to accept very little has been identity politics. So the idea is that identity politics is the electoral substitute for organized labor that was lost after Bill Clinton and Dick Morris decided that you had to have two Republican parties in order to not have more than 12 years of continuous one-party rule. And by the way, the Maoists have lots of points that are correct. It's not that they're wrong about everything.
So for those not experts on Chinese history and political theory, what is a Maoist in a sentence or two?
Well, what I'm really interested in is the experience of the Red Guard, where there's a point where you have to get rid of the intelligentsia in order to have a blank slate for a new world. So effectively what you do is you go after the professors, the doctors, the professionals, and you have to have some way of clearing, if you're going to build something, very often you have to raise whatever trees and houses are previously there.
Now you also have personal experience, both yourself as an academic, but your brother was also an academic and paid a real price from the victimization culture. I think, would you care to just share what happened to your brother and what your thoughts are on it?
It's important because many Democrats have never heard of my brother, whereas almost all Republicans have heard of my brother.
Yes.
And this has to do with the fact that the Democratic allied media mysteriously no longer reports news that is counter-narrative, which is something I associate with sort of the right-wing media as well. So I've gone on Fox and said that Fox is, I consider in large measure a propaganda machine. But the left has learned that they need to do the same thing. And so effectively, they didn't cover the fact that there was a Maoist insurrection at Evergreen State College, which is under the same governor who allowed the Capitol Hill exclusion zone, where the police were shoved out and almost immediately people died. Surprise, surprise.
Right.
So, the Pacific Northwest is experimenting with an extremely dangerous cocktail of this neo or cultural Maoism, effectively, with government support. Now, I have to say that the right behaved much more sensibly because the left has abandoned what we had previously associated as progressive and liberal values with free speech going back to the 60s and the 50s. And I've called this reversal from right to left Carthyism. Yeah. So the problem of left Carthyism, again, I don't have any particular allegiance to one party or the other because they're both useless to me. What I see is just a completely unworkable leadership class that has strayed from traditional American values. And whether you're progressive or conservative or libertarian, the main thing right now is to get back to smart as opposed to stupid.
So you've drawn this distinction here, and I think it's one that we see a lot on college campuses and in our politics and in our media, which is between Maoism or Marxism, this hard radical left, and what we would have once called liberalism. Liberal, not left.
Yes.
And people like Dave Rubin and others have talked about this. You would call yourself, I suppose, a liberal or a progressive in the old sense. Barry Weiss, who's written about the intellectual dark web, which you founded and talks about these things. Barry Weiss has just left the New York Times because they are too hard left for her, and she's an old school liberal.
They're not hard left.
They're not.
They're nuts.
Well, those are synonymous in my mind.
But stupid and crazy shouldn't be a part of a political spectrum. That should be a mental condition. When we lost growth, we became immunocompromised. And all the creepy crawlies are coming out from every particular place. They're coming out from the right. They're coming out from the left. And there's one move that can save the republic, in my opinion, which is that the core left and the core right, who haven't become insane, have to realize that they have more interest in each other than they do in their own wings. Right? And so the idea is, if you think, we have a word in Yiddish called the starker. The starker is the muscle. If the left sees Antifa as its muscle, right? And the idea is that the right sees, I don't know, the Proud Boys or Patriot Prayer or some far right group.
By the way, no one on the right sees the Proud Boys. They're bigoted idiots, and it's just
Antifa is a bunch of lunatics.
But here's a difference just in the political world, and I get that you're coming from the academic and investment
podcast world
and podcast world.
Yep.
But I am more than happy. As far as I know, I've never met a Proud Boy. I think they're bigoted morons. My colleagues, if you had a Democratic senator sitting here, none of them will condemn Antifa. So I'll condemn those guys. Those are not my guys.
Well, you don't have a senator. You have a guy who's never going to run for the Senate. I'll condemn Antifa.
Great. Wonderful. And we are agreed with that. And I'm against anyone who's bigoted or violent.
But what we're trying to do here is we're trying to model what an American conversation is supposed to be, as opposed to a partisan conversation.
Right.
And what that is we continually check in with each other and say, we did some wrong stuff, but we did it because we thought we were reacting to you. Yeah. And then you walk things back. But the problem is, in control theory, when you have positive feedback, when the idea is, I do something because you did it, but you thought that I did, then the idea is you can just kiss your future goodbye. The New York Times is going through, let's create a new word, evergreening. The evergreening of an institution is the point at which the people that the Times probably hired thinking, oh, well, we have an aging readership, we're a legacy media organization, let's get some hip kids to get more clicks and more younger viewers. And the idea is that all those kids were supposed to become somewhat more liberal and moderate as they acquired significant others, children, and mortgages. Yeah. And that didn't happen. And in fact, what happened is that they began to take over the very institution that was hoping to exploit them effectively.
And for clarification, when you say they hired young campus radicals in the hope and expectation they would become somewhat more liberal, help listeners understand on what axis, what more liberal means, because those terms sometimes have varying meanings.
Very good. But there's a huge problem that we need to get to, which is that the reason that we can't get out of our national nightmare at the moment is that the center has to make a move that it refuses to do. And the center, or the core, maybe it would be a better way of saying it, has to admit that it became kleptocratic. And so the corruption of the core left and the core right means that there's nowhere to turn from the extremes. So whenever you say no to the extremes, the thing is, are you telling me that we're going to be back to the core left and the core right and their extraction? So if you think about the United States as a family business, the family business was sensational between 1945 and the early 70s. It built up a tremendous amount of wealth. But then you have a very rich family with a sputtering family business. The first wave of concern, probably through the middle of the Reagan administration, was how do we restart growth so that we can get back to being ourselves? Yeah. All of these supply side gimmicks and the offshoring and the downsizing and the financialization and all of these things were not good enough to actually deal with the underlying problem because it didn't have a diagnosis as to what actually happened back then. What it was good enough to do was to keep some slices of the pie growing at the expense of others. So the idea is that instead of seeing each other as a source of camaraderie or military support or innovation, we started viewing each other as a source of protein. And then we started the process of American self-cannibalization. Okay, well, that's part of what we did with NAFTA. That's part of what we did with our immigration policies. That's what the whole globalization stuff really amounts to. So the idea is that right now what you have is you have certain sectors that grow by cannibalizing other sectors. And as a result, if we call that growth, we can fudge our national statistics.
So who are the winners and who are the losers? Who are the cannibals and who's dinner?
Well, it depends. In what car did you arrive to this meeting? That would be the question. Please don't answer that. But the idea is that most of us know whether we're winners or losers. Weirdly, if you're flying first class, you're probably a loser because the real winners are in a completely different airport or terminal altogether. Yeah. Right. And so the idea is we have an invisible winner class that doesn't necessarily even want to act like the winner class. Some of those people, by the way, are winners because they contributed. And that was the traditional way. Others are winners because they figured out how to cannibalize somebody else. And so we have this very weird thing, which is that we have so much cannibalization that we've given up on merit because we now see merit as an excuse. And this is actually a fair point of the Maoists who don't see a fair world. So there was an implicit sort of morality in market mechanisms. Now, as a person on the left, I'm a huge fan of markets. Why? Because there's nothing more progressive. The word progressive contains progress. Yes. Markets are what lift people up.
Yeah.
Now, when those markets become dominated by rent-seeking and political economy and capture...
Can't tell our listeners what rent-seeking means.
Well, rent-seeking is an economist's insult. It means that your source of wealth is non-productive.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a technical term. We can get into what a rent is at an economic level, but just assume that the word rent is being used in a way that is different than you may. It's analogous to certain other forms of rent, but the key point is it's the debasing of market morality. There's a Judeo-Christian sort of aspect to the idea of a functioning meritocracy in which we are rewarded in part, not in whole, but in part, based on our contribution. The market doesn't work perfectly. Even if an honest free market economist has to recognize that market failure is a part of every market.
True, don't we? And do you have this fear that there has been a mainstreaming of not just not liking the other side, but actually not liking the country itself, the American project?
Are you familiar with Othello?
Yeah, we were just talking about it today, as a matter of fact.
It features prominently in Brave New World, which, as it so happens, we were discussing.
The problem is Iago. Now, Iago deranges the protagonist, I guess, Othello, against his beloved Desdemona. And the idea is that by putting certain ideas into the head of Othello, Othello will actually carry out the murder of Desdemona and figure out too late who has in fact caused him to destroy that which he loves. Now, right at the moment, we have a problem with the Iago media. The Iago media is found both on the left and on the right. Everybody's got a narrative. When the news is narrative aligned, they report the news. When the news is counter-narrative, they either don't touch it at all, or they lie, or they spin. There's another concept called Russell conjugation, for example.
Russell conjugation.
Bertrand Russell, a Brit of some note, went on to the BBC and he said something which I think is fascinating. He noticed that the word synonym does not cover certain cases very well. For example, Fink versus whistleblower. Technically, they're both synonyms at a content level. But the emotional instruction is to hate the Fink and to praise the whistleblower, even though they're the same person. Now, Frank Luntz, bizarre.
Frank is a friend. I know him.
I went to college with Frank. Frank Luntz did not know the term, but he effectively reinvented and weaponized Russell conjugation. So the idea is that we are all against illegal aliens and we are for undocumented workers. We oppose the death tax, but we support an estate tax. And the fact is,
language is weaponized in politics and modern discourse.
Well, exactly. And so where we are right now is we're in a situation in which our media derange us every day. And by the way, media is going to include tech to hate each other. Tech is the new media. And in this situation,
with greater power than the New York Times ever had.
Amen, brother. And so the problem that we're having is that what works as both business and politics is to get Othello to murder Desdemona on a daily basis. And that is what we play out as our heads are filled. We don't understand why we can't talk to our loved ones, why Thanksgiving dinners don't work. We're a little bit confused as to why not only is George Washington face down from his podium with 1619 scrawled on it, and when somebody publishes, call them the 1619 riots, the de facto head of the New York Times, Nicole Hannah-Jones, says it would be an honor. You laugh.
And that's going to be taught in schools across the country. The 1619 Project
but the same thing is true,
explicitly revisionist.
And the same thing is true with libtards.